Welcome to the C-Bomb. This confidence podcast is for real modern-day women who are ready to rid themselves of what's holding them back. My name's Rebecca Sparks. I'm a confidence and life transition coach. I'm the founder of The Daily Guru, and I'm your host for the C-Bomb. This podcast tackles all the tricky aspects of lacking self-confidence and is here to help you make some necessary and powerful changes in your life. Each episode, we dive into all the gritty topics which contribute to lacking self-confidence. So if you're wanting to radically improve your self-esteem and overall life experience, then you are in the right place. So let's get started. Hello and welcome. I am so excited to have you join me for episode 1 of the C-Bomb. This confidence podcast is something that I've dreamt about launching for quite a number of years now, so I am over the moon to be sharing it with you. I decided to call it the C-Bomb because as a confidence coach, talking about self-confidence is something I do on a regular basis, but something I notice with all of the clients that I've worked with and most of the people who approach me to learn more about this topic is that there is an embarrassment, a sort of shame attached to it, as though a worry that they're the only people in the world that are having these feelings and thoughts and that everyone else has their stuff in check. It's like it's taboo, and that just completely isn't the case. So this podcast is for real women and men who are tired of feeling less than what society expects of them, less than what others want from them, less than what they had hoped for themselves, less than what they had dreamt of. Ultimately, this is for people who feel not good enough and that they aren't getting the outcomes that they want and desire and ultimately deserve in their life. This is for you because I want to tell you that this isn't something that you're just feeling. This is something that most people experience and they just aren't talking about it. So this is what this podcast is here for. For those of you who aren't familiar, I am a confidence and life transition coach, which means every single day I'm working in the nooks and crannies of confidence. I work with clients from all over the world on varying different elements which impact, contribute, and affect lacking self-confidence. From poor decision-making skills, unconfident communication, unfulfilling relationships, imposter syndrome at work, power imbalances in relationships, over-worrying all the time, people-pleasing, being too much in our heads, not living authentically, having poor boundaries in our life, apologizing too much, struggling to build trust and letting people in, and the list goes on. These are the topics that are common signals of challenges around self-confidence, and they are also very common struggles for most people. But most people are either too embarrassed to start talking about these challenges. They think they should have their stuff in check and that they're the only ones that are feeling this way. Or they simply just don't have time. There is so much going on in their world and their life that it's just something else on the to-do list, no matter how much they know that it's a priority. So for all those reasons, I decided to create the C-Bomb to allow me to start sharing some insights into the topics around self-confidence, about why we behave the way we do and how you can start building your self-confidence one step at a time. So today we're starting off by exploring in episode 1 and taking a look at what self-confidence is to help us better understand what it is, what it isn't, how it is impacted in our internal world and our external world, and most importantly, how we can begin to master this quality in our own life. So I want to start with a question for you, and that is, what does self-confidence mean to you? And what I mean by this is, how do you know when it is present? How do you think, feel, act, and behave when you are feeling confident? And if you have a pen and paper nearby, or you can make some notes on your phone, on your laptop, make a note of this right now, because confidence, how we know it's present, there are lots of commonalities amongst people, but it is also very subjective. What it means to one person is different to somebody else. Therefore, you understanding your model of the world and how you know when you're feeling confident and when it's present is super important before you become too influenced by others. So now that you have those listed down, I'm going to share with you some of the common examples which come up. And that is what I hear from my clients on a regular basis are things like it's an energy, it's a feeling of certainty when you're in a scenario or, in an environment with friends. It's an energy, a certainty, an inner trust. It's an authenticity of not putting on a facade, not trying to be someone else other than who we really are, not worrying about what other people think of us. So there's a genuine authenticity around it. And as I said, there's an energy, it's a presence and a physiology. Quite often people describe it about the way we physically present ourselves and show up. So maybe some of those are on your list. Maybe there's some other items as well. But now I want to ask you, how do you feel, act, and think when you are lacking self-confidence? What's the difference? Think about specific scenarios in your life where you know you don't show up as your best self and that you are lacking confidence and self-esteem. Think about how you feel, think, and act in those scenarios. And again, if you have the chance, write this down, because this is going to be your reference point as you continue to work through building your self-confidence. How do you know when it's present? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And how are you acting? And again, I want to share some of the most common examples which come up, because this might trigger some examples that you recognize in your own life that you haven't thought of straight away. So often people feel that they need to put other people's needs above their own. So they feel there's like a guilt, a shame, an uncomfortableness about putting their needs above anyone else. So they continually put other people's needs above themselves. They compare themselves to others on a regular basis. They agree to do things that they don't want to do out of wanting to please others, be seen as a really good friend, a really good co-worker, just a really good person. So they agree to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. And one of the other side effects of this particular one is that also they can then often try and get out of commitments as they don't feel they have the energy to do it, because they never authentically committed to that commitment to begin with. They take constructive criticism personally because their self-esteem is so low already that any type of negative or seen as negative feedback, they just can't take it, and they take it completely personally, whether it's constructive or not. They have difficulty setting boundaries with people they care about in their life. They are unable to voice genuine opinions. And this is for a fear of rejection from the community, from the people that they care about. So it is safer and easier and feels better to follow the crowd and say what everyone else is saying, even if this conflicts with their own values at times. So they're unable to voice their own genuine opinions. They chase other people's approval. They second guess themselves on a regular basis. They worry what other people think. They are unable to believe compliments. So not only do they take criticism, constructive criticism, really personally, they're not able to believe the good stuff either when it comes through. They assume that people are lying to them, or, they're just saying that to be nice. So they can't even build their self-confidence up by receiving positive feedback. And often they feel exhausted a lot of the time, because this is an extremely tiring way of living. So if any of that resonated with you, any of those experiences, and you recognize that perhaps these are showing up in particular areas of your life, I want to say, please don't judge yourself right now. This is something I see all the time, and more people than you could even imagine experience these feelings. So now I want to talk about the components that are attached to lacking self-confidence. Why does this happen? So we've just explored what confidence looks like, what it doesn't look like, and how we know when we're lacking self-confidence. So why does lacking self-confidence occur? Well, there's three key components to this. The first one is we believe the negative chit-chatter in our heads. The second is we act in response to our unchallenged and unregulated internal dialogue. So the thoughts that are going through our head, we are not challenging them and we're not regulating them. And number three, we no longer trust ourselves. So these three are really important, because this gives us a guide, a direction of what needs to change in order for us to manage and master self-confidence. So how do we change? Let's focus on that. How do we start creating change in our life? Well, there are key principles to creating change. And the first thing I want us to focus on here is that everything we do in life is because of a feeling that we are either chasing, avoiding, or responding to. I'm going to say that again because this is a really important principle to understand in order to start taking control of our self-confidence and our actions and our beliefs and everything that follows. So everything we do in life is because of a feeling we are either chasing, avoiding, or responding to. And now here's the really interesting part. Our thoughts create our feelings create our actions, and our actions create our results in our life. Therefore, if we want to change absolutely anything in our life, any area, we must start with our thoughts. And so this takes me back to the first two key components of lacking self-confidence, and that is believing our negative internal chit-chatter in our heads and acting in response to this unchallenged internal dialogue. So these are the two key areas that I want us to start off by exploring. And I'm going to do that by introducing you to your internal guides, your internal narrators. Now, one of the biggest things I want you to understand here is that our internal dialogue is not us. It's a catalogue of experiences, beliefs, and stories which we have saved in our memory and which have become our compass and our reference point for the world. They're like a library used as a reference point to make sense of the world, to help us make quick and efficient decisions, and also, most importantly, to keep us safe. If we don't regulate our thoughts, most of us stay stuck in these stories and beliefs, and they guide our entire life. And most of us live unconsciously aware of what stories, beliefs, and experiences are driving us day to day. So if there's been an experience or a story that has occurred in our life, say when we were 10 years old, maybe that experience and that lesson and that belief that was created from that really served a purpose at that age, because it was there to protect us and it was there to teach us a lesson. But if we're still using that story and that narrative to guide us now when we're in our 30s, 40s, or 50s, and the scenario has completely changed, you have completely changed, that is no longer serving us. And this is what most of us are doing on a daily basis because we don't regulate our thoughts. We're just unconsciously accessing all of these stories and beliefs which are stored in our brain to help us make our decisions on a daily basis. So the importance of introducing you to your internal narrators is so that you can become familiar with them. And then secondly, you can start decluttering. You can start deciding which of these stories that your narrators are accessing are of service to you and which ones are not. Which of the beliefs are your beliefs and which ones are others that were borrowed when you were growing up or through particular experiences that, again, no longer serve you. So we all have internal tapes, dialogues that play. Most of us let these stories play out every single day, unchecked and unregulated, and they drive our behavior because remember, our thoughts create our feelings create our actions create our outcomes. So understanding what tape is playing and what are these common thoughts that are driving our feelings and behaviors is super important. So let's see who is speaking up in your internal world. I want to introduce you, first of all, to your critic. Now, most of you would probably be really familiar with this phrase, the critic. It's talked about quite a lot right now, which is fantastic. I want you to understand with the critic that if you're experiencing low self-confidence, it is likely that your critic is dominating your internal dialogue. The thing that you need to understand about the critic is that it's deeply rooted in worry, in fear, and it is highly subjective. Also, it is highly motivated by fear, and it uses this to control you because the critic isn't choosy between healthy and unhealthy fear. So what I mean by that is if you are standing in a street and you suddenly see a child run out into the road and there is a car coming, your head and feelings and emotions are going to be filled immediately with worrying thoughts and concern and alert. So they may be thoughts such as, there's danger, you need to do something to protect this child, there's worry, there's anxiousness, all of these different feelings. And that is a healthy response to a scary situation. However, if you are sitting in a boardroom and you are concerned that you are about to be asked a question and asked to present in front of the room, and you are filled with fear and anxiety, and you've got sweaty palms, and your critic is running a narrative that you're going to be embarrassed and you're going to stand up and you're going to, fluff your words and whatever, all because when you were 10 years old, you got up on stage at school and you had an embarrassing experience. It didn't go the way that you planned. You got really shy. A few people laughed. And that story and experience has stayed with you. What the critic does is it says, this is like this, and therefore I'm going to alert you and make you worried and scared and try and protect you from having any more pain. But the thing is that this isn't a healthy fear. Just because these two scenarios look the same, it doesn't mean they need to be treated the same. But your critic is telling you to do that. And unless you interrupt the story and experience and belief that is driving your behavior and driving your actions, then you will continue to believe this and you'll continue to perpetuate this in your life. And that is the results that you will continue to get for yourself. So instead, recognizing that we can choose something different is really important. Now, you might decide to call your critic something different. Many of my clients call them, the bully, the worrier, whatever feels right for you, that's what you should call it. But the two things I want you to remember mostly about the critic is that it needs to feel safe and it needs to feel heard. And this is really important because often when people are experiencing a critic for the first time and becoming aware of it, they think that the best process to manage this perceived negative chit-chatter is to override it with being positive. Add a positive thought, ignore it. But the thing is that the critic it does have a purpose. It's trying to keep you safe. It's trying to make sure you don't put yourself in a situation that has happened before where you could get hurt. Or perhaps someone has told you this and your critic has believed it. Maybe this is a belief from family, like don't embarrass yourself. You shouldn't speak out. And the critic just continues to ride that conversation in your head. So it's super important that you are aware that your critic needs to feel heard and understood in order for it to subside. So the way we do this is, instead of ignoring it because it will just become louder, is to acknowledge the thought. And this is about raising our self-awareness, which is what this whole podcast is about, becoming familiar with your internal dialogue. What's the script and is it serving you? So when you acknowledge the thought that the critic is sharing with you in a moment where you're feeling lacking self-confidence, anxious, worrying, observe the thought, understand why it's suggesting that for you, and then offer an alternative. So in your head, you might be thinking, with the boardroom example, your critic would be saying to you, you have every right to be worried right now. They're going to ask you to stand up. They're going to ask you to speak. This is going to be absolutely awful. You should try and get out of here because otherwise you're just going to put yourself in a really embarrassing situation. If you notice those thoughts coming up, instead you can be asking yourself, well, I understand that has happened in the past, but in this situation is not the same. And the reason why it's not the same is because I know my content, I'm well rehearsed. So if someone asks me a question, I'm super familiar with the topic and I feel comfortable. If I'm not comfortable, I'm happy to say that I will come back to you later. And lastly, this is a room full of my colleagues who I trust and I know I have their support, so I don't feel unsafe. That type of response in your head when you're thinking through it logically is going to ease your critic because it is balanced and it is calm. And I'm going to talk more to who that voice is very shortly. But more about the critic. So the critic has a number of different beliefs that show up. So how do you know if the critic is present? Well, the critic, firstly, it has a number of different telltale signs. If you are listening to the critic, you often feel fear, panic, worry, anxiousness. You are often consumed with thoughts about worrying into the future. And this is that controlling aspect again, where you're thinking ahead and you're trying to think through every scenario that could play out, so that you could possibly avoid any type of shame or, horrid feelings. And this also happens with the past. We're consumed by thoughts of the past where we run over scenarios in our head over and over again as if we could play them out differently. The critic often has you blaming someone else for the way you feel. And this is often one that people find really difficult to fully accept and understand when you are first learning about the critic. And the reason for this is when we have had extremely challenging experiences in our life, it feels very justified and very natural to be able to blame someone else who has hurt us for the way that we feel. But the problem with that is that if we blame others and say that others are responsible for the way that we feel, this is completely disempowering. It suggests that we do not have control or responsibility over our feelings and that it is completely at the mercy of everybody else, which means we have no power in our life. Whereas when we take ownership and we recognize that no matter how awful a situation might be, we are still choosing the emotion that we are going to attach to that experience. The moment that we realize that, and I'm not saying that's easy, but it is a choice. The moment we do that, we take back our power. Because we may choose to sit in sadness and worry for a period of time, but knowing that we choose that because it's healthy to experience all of those emotions and then move through it, rather than blaming somebody, means that we're still in control of and owning, and we feel empowered around our emotions. So that's another sign that the critic, that you're listening to your critic. And lastly, you're trying to control everything around you. This is such a common sign of the critic. It tells you that in order to be safe, if you could just control everything and everyone, then it will feel fine. So we do this by trying to control our thoughts, our experiences, and other people around us. And this never leads to a healthy, happy, functioning space for us, because we are never really in control. Like, life is constantly changing and evolving around us, and us being open to that idea means that then we're in flow with it. And then that means that we can respond and pivot versus trying to remain fixed in an unfixed environment. Lastly, some of the other common beliefs that come up when we are listening and responding to the critic are we worry about the effects of outcome. We worry about what's going on. And the critic tells us that if we are worrying about a situation, that makes us a good person. And that if we worry about it, that might actually impact an outcome. And that worrying is a good thing. And that absolutely is not the case, because worrying does absolutely nothing to impact an outcome. Action actually impacts outcomes. Worrying just suspends us in an anxiousness and a horrid feeling while we await the outcome. So there is no impact, and it definitely doesn't make us a good person because we are unable to change the outcome in the first place. The critic believes we can't cope. This is obviously a complete lie, but it is using this to control you, to try and keep you safe. If it constantly tells you you can't cope, that means you are going to stop putting yourself out there into new scenarios, which the critic is scared of. The critic is scared of new and different because it doesn't have reference points for that. So it tries to keep you safe and tell you can't cope. The critic also believes that it really matters what other people think of you. Now, I want to be clear, as human beings, we all need and like approval from others, and that can be a really wonderful thing. But if this approval has become unbalanced and unhealthy, then this is where the critic is in charge. So what I mean by that is, if you notice yourself trying to make a decision, and before you go inwards to ask yourself how you feel about it, you immediately go external and ask others, or start thinking to yourself, I wonder what this person would want me to do in this situation, then that is the critic that is driving the narrative. So as a roundup on the critic, I want you to be clear that the critic wants to be safe, it uses fear to control you, it wants to be heard, it lives in the past and future, not in the present. It has a huge catalogue of past disasters to refer to and therefore can't really see a bright future, which is why it's super important to regulate this and interrupt the narrative. If you ignore it, it will get louder. If you acknowledge it, it will calm down. If you feel anxious, concerned, or worried, it is likely you are listening to your critical voice. So now I want to introduce you to your second guide. Now, this isn't a narrator, but it is an internal guide that you can use in order to understand the quality of your thoughts and who is running the show. And this is your inner child, or also known as your feeling center. It responds directly to the thoughts with a necessary feeling. So remember what we learned earlier, and that is that everything we do in life is because we are chasing, responding, or avoiding a feeling. Well, this is where this comes into play. So the child or feeling center is a sponge to your most dominant internal voice, providing a responsive feeling to that. So when your critic is dominating your internal dialogue, that feeling center feels a certain way. So if you notice yourself feeling things like shame and fear and worry and anxiousness and envy and sadness and hatred and emotions like this on a regular basis, it is likely that your critic is running the show. Now, what's really interesting here is when I work with clients through this and help them access their critic and their inner child and start becoming really, really familiar with them so that they can start taking charge instead of letting these internal guides run at an unconscious level. Many clients share that they notice their feeling before they notice their thought. So some of us, we're more driven that way. We feel things before we recognize the thought. Others will recognize the thought before they recognize the feeling. So I share that with you because I want you to take a moment just to quickly reflect and ask yourself, when you are in a situation where you're feeling a really lacking of self-confidence and, really low self-esteem and not feeling great about yourself, do you notice a thought first or do you notice the feeling? Because as we know, the thought does come first. Everything we do starts with a thought that creates our feelings, it creates our actions, and it creates our outcomes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the order that you notice it in. So if you recognize your feeling first, you will then need to follow that feeling to ask yourself, what thought did I just believe in order to feel this way? Whereas if you recognize the thought first, you can then notice the subsequent feeling that follows that. Now, a few things to remember about the child and feeling center. It is a barometer of how healthy our thoughts are. It needs to feel nurtured like a child, especially when it's responding to the critic. And also, it wants to feel safe and it wants to feel free. They're the overarching objectives of our inner child, our feeling center. Now I'd like to introduce you to your final narrator, your final internal guide. This is known as your higher self, your adult voice. So I mentioned this earlier on today when I shared the example of talking to your critic and offering a more balanced view, offering a different viewpoint that was no longer accessing all those old stories and was actually assessing the true scenarios that were playing out and really looking at it with fresh eyes. This is your wisdom. This is your higher self. So our internal voice that is balanced it's calm, it's considered, it's wise, it's able to detach from drama and ego and all those different things that play out that the critic just latches hold of, and instead it then shares true guidance with you. Now, so many of my clients, when I share this with them, say to me, I don't actually think I have this voice in my head, and I totally understand where they're coming from because their critic has been talking for so long in their head that it's almost like their wisdom is a whisper. It's super quiet, but I want to reassure you, if you're thinking the same, you absolutely have this. And all of my clients have been able to then finally access it. It's like a muscle. If we haven't been using it, we've lost it a little. It's gone very quiet. So in order to change that, we have to request its presence. We have to consciously try and access our wisdom, our higher self. So when you're going through scenarios like the one I mentioned earlier, and we are experiencing something that we don't want to experience, we realize that we're believing a thought that our critic is sharing with us because it's trying to keep us safe, it's making us feel very worried. We have to take a step back and consciously ask ourselves, well, why might this situation be different? How is it not like the situation before? So that your critic can feel at ease and your wisdom then has space to really explore what's going on and really offer great advice for you. And the funny thing is that, again, if you're still telling yourself, I just don't think I have that ability, if you think about some of your closest friends you have in your life or family members that you really care about, and they come to you for advice or information, and your expertise or input on a particular situation, it is often your wisdom that you will be accessing for them. So they will come to you, maybe they've had an argument with a loved one and they're full of emotion and they're just responding and reacting to this situation, and they can't really think so clearly because they're just full of all this emotion. You are then able to offer a really balanced view. You are able to talk to them about what's potentially really occurring here. When you take away all of the drama and sometimes ego and a lot of emotion that's been added to the situation, and you're able to help them through that. So what I'm asking you to do here is to turn that voice round and use it on yourself and start practicing doing that, because this is game changing. When you can start having your higher self, your adult voice, directing the majority of your narrative, it completely changes the results and outcomes that are going on in your life, because you move from a fear-based, control-based way of living to a way of living that is about opportunity and a way of living that is focused on growth, and it's calm. So the things you need to remember about wisdom is that it's your own personal guide, your internal wisdom. Some people connect this with their religion. Others have no religion and they still have this wisdom. It's in all of us. Wisdom is accepting of life and it is able to go with the flow. I've talked to you today about the fact that the critic is super focused on control. It's trying to control everything that goes on around us in order to keep us safe. Whereas wisdom accepts that that's not the way life is. Everything is ever changing, and you have to be able to go with the flow and pivot in order to be able to really live life as life is folding out in front of you. Wisdom is able to make decisions more objectively than the critic, because wisdom wants you to grow, and it's fair and it's balanced and it's kind. So you now have been introduced to your 3 internal guides. So now that you have them, I want to take you through an activity, an exercise here. And to start off, I want you to think of a situation in your life where you lack self-confidence, a common situation that might occur for you. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's with family, maybe it's with a particular group of friends. Think of this scenario where you are lacking self-confidence on a regular basis. And I want you to ask yourself, what are the common thoughts you think in this particular scenario? So what are those common thoughts that are coming up and feelings, and that you are believing in order to make this scenario some situation that you're lacking self-confidence? Now, without judgment, I want you to ask yourself where this belief and story may have originated from. So as we've just been learning, if you are listening to your critic is accessing a library of stories, beliefs, and experiences to help you move through this. And those experiences, stories, and beliefs aren't supporting you. So ask yourself, where are they coming from? Are they your beliefs? Are they borrowed from someone from your childhood? Are they experiences that happened to you but are no longer serving you? Where do they originate from? Now that you can see that, I want you to also ask yourself, where else in your life is this story influencing you? So often when we have a particularly powerful story that the critic uses, it will show up in a few different areas. So if we've had a situation in our past that made us really fearful and scared, the critic might use that in a few different scenarios. So what other areas in your life has this been influencing you? And now finally, I want you to think about what would you need to happen, think, or feel to be able to let go of this situation? So you've got the situation in mind, you're lacking self-confidence, you're believing a particular thought that's happening there, you know why you've been pulling up that particular experience or story or belief. What would you now need to think, feel, or happen to let go of that story and to feel different in this circumstance? So now I'm going to take you through a super quick example of one of my clients who has been through a similar experience here, and we use this activity. So, and I want you also to know that at the end of this podcast, I'm going to be uploading this activity onto my website as a downloadable worksheet, because this is a really, really fantastic activity to do on a regular basis if you are lacking self-confidence and you want to get underneath it. Like, why do I feel this? What experiences are influencing me, and how can I let it go? So if you are not able to make notes here, don't worry. I'm going to be uploading this onto my website so that you can download the worksheet and use it as many times as you like. So this particular client of mine, so her experience is she lacks self-confidence at work. She finds herself in a position that she thinks she's not good enough. She thinks she isn't the right person for her role, and that there are lots of other people who are much smarter and better than her, even though she was only recently promoted. So what are the common thoughts that she's thinking in this scenario? So when she explored this, she realized that she was thinking to herself some of the things I've just said. Everyone else around her is smarter than her. Her boss made a mistake in promoting her. She isn't smart enough and she isn't fast enough. She doesn't think quick enough to be able to do her job as effectively as she wants to. When I asked her what beliefs and stories may have originated this made this situation have originated from, we very quickly realized that as a child, education is something that's really highly valued in her family. And as a child, she was incredibly smart, like a really smart cookie. And then she went through some really terrible health issues. And that meant that she had to go on to some really specific medication for a period of time. And that really influenced her ability to absorb information and learn and to process information the way that she used to be able to. And therefore, part of her identity was rocked. She went from being someone who was really, praised for her ability to learn and how smart she was, to suddenly was being told that she wasn't as smart as she used to be. And in her mind, she saw that as something negative. And the feedback she was getting from her family, even though it was filled with love and no bad intention, that had weighed on her and stayed with her. So where else was this story influencing her? It was showing up in lots of different spaces, particularly around education. She was studying to improve her skill set and her capabilities at work. And every time she went to submit a piece of coursework, she would tell herself, I'm not smart enough, I'm not going to do very well. The critic would just be running riot in this particular situation. Then what thought or feeling did she need to let go of in order to improve this situation? She needed to access her wisdom and realize that the voice that was jumping on top of her was not helping, and it was not accurate. The feedback she'd had as a child, it was never badly intended. It wasn't ever meant to make her feel terrible, but it did make her not feel great about herself. And now she was using that exact same information to sort of punish herself in the here and now. When she was able to let go of that and just focus on her work, what was so interesting was she started getting distinctions. She is a smart cookie now, and she was using a story from the past that was holding her back. Now, she's still working through this, but it was a really exciting and interesting moment in her growth where she recognized that this story, she is still choosing to bring it up, and it is holding her back from being the person that she actually wants to be. So I hope that's helped you see how this exercise can be super powerful and effective in creating change. And as I said, I'm going to upload this activity worksheet onto my website so that you can download it and work your way through it with your own particular situations. And now I want to finish off by talking to you about the key to changing our internal dialogue. So we've talked a lot today about the fact that we now have an awareness of the different scripts that can run and who's in charge of that and how we bring it more to the conscious level in order to take charge of what thoughts are running, riot in our heads. So how do we change that internal dialogue? Well, firstly, there are 4 steps. Firstly, It's awareness, self-awareness. That's exactly what we've just talked about. Having clarity on what your thoughts are. What thoughts are currently driving you? That's all that we've just been talking about. Secondly, do not judge yourself for these thoughts. Instead, acknowledge and reassure yourself. This is about making your critic feel safe so it becomes much quieter and gives space for wisdom. Thirdly, ask different questions to access different outcomes. We have to request the presence of wisdom, and the way we do that is by asking different questions. So when we are in a situation that is fearful, instead of asking ourselves, what are the 10 things that could go wrong here, which critic just loves because it just thinks about all the things that it's then going to try and control and influence and change and keep you safe and pull you back, you can ask things like, why is this situation different from what's happened in the past? How am I safe in this situation? Who can I get support from to make sure that it goes successfully? So ask different questions and you get different outcomes. But the quality of our questions really drives the quality of our outcomes, because our brain is it just processes and gives us the answer. It's not subjective. So you need to be in charge of what questions you're asking yourself when you are experiencing challenges. And lastly, practice. This is something I say to my clients all the time. This awareness and becoming familiar with all your internal guides and what's been happening and how to change it is such an amazing experience, but it really amounts to nothing if you don't put in the time and start practicing it, because it just remains a really nice piece of awareness, but doesn't become a new habit, a new routine, a new you, unless you find time, literally on a daily basis, to observe what's been going on and what you consciously want to change. So carve out time. Journaling in the evening is a fantastic way to observe what went on, what would you do differently, and also where are you growing? What decisions are you starting to make differently because of this new awareness? So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for joining me. I highly recommend you just take a few moments now to think about, what are you going to change as a result of spending time and listening to this and any new knowledge that you have gathered from this podcast? What are you going to do differently and how are you going to implement it? Because that's where the change really happens, making a decision and a commitment to yourself and then honoring it. And it is amazing to see how quickly your confidence will change when you do that. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.